Welcome to the Global Philosophy of Religion project at the University of Birmingham, led by Professor Yujin Nagasawa. We at Closer to Truth love to present these discussions. Today, we explore Islamic philosophy and metaphysics with Professor Rahim Acar, who teaches philosophy of religion at Marmara University, Faculty of Theology in Istanbul, Turkey. He received his Ph.D. in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations Department at Harvard University. And among his research interests are the philosophy and metaphysics of creation and divine creative action. Rahim, welcome to Closer to Truth and the Global Philosophy of Religion project. Let's stress understanding Islamic philosophy in its own context, and then if and where relevant in comparison with other religions. And I know your comparative study between Avicenna's and Aquinas's positions on creation is ideal. So let's start with just a very brief overview of Islamic philosophy, very brief history, and the major categories of inquiry. And please stress Avicenna, Ibn Sina, who we will discuss, who you've researched extensively and we'll discuss in several questions.
Robert, thank you very much for inviting me for this lovely conversation activity. And first, let me try to clarify what Islamic philosophy, as far as I understand. We may have such a working definition of Islamic philosophy. The philosophical activity carried out by medieval philosophers in the lands where Muslims held political authority. Islamic philosophers wrote primarily in Arabic. Their doctrines and discussions combined the heritage of Aristotelianism, Neoplatonism, and religious teachings, Islamic, Jewish, or Christian. Some scholars prefer to use Arabic philosophy because of the connotations of the term Islamic, religious connotations. They emphasize it is Arabic philosophy, taking into account that non-Muslim figures are also important in this philosophical activity. However, the term Islamic philosophy in this context should not be taken in the strict sense of Islamic religion, but in the sense, in a rather loose sense, Islamic civilization or something. And Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi and Kindi and also like Moses Maimonides and figures like this are well-known representatives of this Islamic philosophy.
What are some of the major categories that Islamic philosophy deals with?
The major problems of dealt with in Islamic philosophy, we may include the limits of human knowledge about God. We know God, and to what extent can we know God on rational grounds? The relation between rational philosophical knowledge claims and religious teachings based on prophetic revelation, arguments for the existence of God, Aristotelian explanation of things by four causes, causal properties of things, atheistic theories of to explain the functioning of the natural world, and some people, some theologians, for example, developed or borrowed the atheistic theory of things, and nature of causation, the extent of divine control over the universe, etc., etc.
Okay, good. Well, I love those et ceteras. As a subset of Islamic philosophy, how would you distinguish Islamic metaphysics? Because we'll focus on that. We do that on Closer to Truth. What are the primary issues? I know essence versus existence. Again, very briefly now, because we'll go in depth later.
Islamic metaphysics. See, the term Islamic metaphysics sounds kind of problematic, just like the term Islamic philosophy sounded problematic to some philosophers. So I should underline that the Islamic in this context does not have anything to do with religion. Obviously, there is religion. There are a lot of Muslim scholars, and some people understood Islam this way, some people understood Islam that way. And Islam as a monotheistic religion, obviously you have the notion of the creator, and the way the universe related to God is the creation. And you have also the problem of God's control over the universe. And you also have the problem of the human destiny, human freedom. And these are basically important questions on which different groups developed, somehow conflicting, diverging positions.
So in essence, it's more that the metaphysics that evolved from very sophisticated scholars and philosophers within Islamic civilization at those times, as opposed to a metaphysics that is derived from the Islamic religion, say.
Yeah. I mean, Islam as a religion, see, in Islam, in principle, there is no religious authority. Obviously, people were face to face with religious texts after the Prophet died. So, in principle, people had the opportunity and freedom to understand and to make sense of the texts the way they could make up. Obviously, of course, in practice, you have religious authorities, but in principle, there is no religious authority. So what religion, what those texts say and what people understand always had a kind of distance between them.
Good. Let's begin by focusing on the question of the existence of God. So please give a very brief history of the arguments for the existence of God in Islam and any arguments against, but please describe particularly Avicenna's what's called proof of the truthful, that there must be a necessary existent that cannot not exist.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. This is the essential question. See, in Islamic philosophy, we had previously Islamic theological discussions. Theologians are not formally included in philosophy, Islamic philosophy, but among theologians, mutakallimun, or people of kalam, they developed arguments for the existence of God. And Al-Kindi, who is supposed to be the first Muslim philosopher, had used arguments for the existence of God somehow similar, quite similar to the argument which is supported by Muslim theologians a lot. This is the argument, this is the so-called Hudus argument, or the kind of Kalam cosmological argument, as we say in modern times, the, let's say, prototype of this Kalam cosmological argument. And this argument is based on the idea that the universe began to exist after non-existence. If the universe began to exist, obviously you need an agent which make the universe begin to exist. So all this argument, I mean, different people highlighted different causes, different reasons to justify that the universe must begin to exist after non-existence. And Al-Kindi was one of the people, one of the philosophers who pursued this argument. And there are also arguments or parts of arguments attempting to show that infinite causal regress among causes is not acceptable. Circular causal explanation of the existence of things, the universe, is not again acceptable, not acceptable. So there must be an agent, a subject, initiating the whole process or governing the whole process at the beginning of the causal chain.
And that makes internal sense, but then how then do you go from that agent to that agent being a necessary existent that in a robust logical sense could not exist?
Actually, there are various versions of this argument, and this argument is that there must be a first cause. We also find some version of it in Ibn Sina's Al-Shifa, or the healing, and it may be considered part of the argument for the existence of God in a larger sense, either the Hudus argument or Kalam cosmological argument, or Ibn Sina's own way of argument based on the concepts of necessary existence and contingent existence.
Okay, so just walk me through that briefly, Avicenna's argument for contingent versus necessary existence.
Let me explain a bit Ibn Sina's argument. For Ibn Sina, at the beginning of his the metaphysical part of the healing, he discusses what the primary concepts on which all our discussion, all other discussions are based. And these primary notions, these primary concepts, like the concept of existence, like the concept of necessary, these are primary concepts. We immediately know them. We cannot derive them or demonstrate them on the basis of some other more evident notions or anything. So these are primary concepts. So and Ibn Sina somehow identifies existence with necessity. So anything that exists is necessary. Anything that necessary somehow must exist.
I understand the latter way. If it's necessary, it must exist. I'd have more trouble the first direction. If it exists, it's necessary, because a lot of things that exist.
Okay, so God,
from Ibn Sina,
sure. From Ibn Sina's perspective, God is the self-necessary being, and since God is self-necessary, God must exist on its own. But we, in our metaphysical inquiry, trying to investigate the existent things, including ourselves, things around us, the existent, coexistent. And we try why all these things exist. And are they necessary? Do they exist on their own? Do they need something else in order to exist? Basically, we ask these kind of questions to explain the existent things, coexistent things. And so, since existence equals or identical to necessity, and we look around and we cannot see that any of these things are necessary. They do not exist on their own. To explain their existence, we need to refer to something further, to a cause. So basically, we can explain the existence of the contingently existing things around us by referring to a self-necessary being, which exists on its own, which is self-necessary. So it means that it does not need anything further in order to exist, while all the rest, the so-called contingent beings, need some cause to necessitate them.
You write about harsh debates among Islamic philosophers in the relationship between natural theology and revealed theology or revelation. What was the essence of those debates, those harsh debates?
Let us put the question in a somehow slightly different way. The harsh debate is between, let's say, philosophers and theologians, between people regarding the nature of or the relation between rational theology and revealed theology. Obviously, Muslim philosophers, I mean like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina or Avicenna, and people follow their course, granted a larger or wider scope to human reason in knowing things, in understanding theological things. So rational theology, they granted a larger extension to rational theology. So we can know God, we can prove the existence of God, we can reach certain amount of knowledge about God. We can also reach, a philosopher, reach what the prophet who establishes the, let's say, the true religion, philosophers can also know what the philosopher can know. Even though the way they know and the way they express the same knowledge claims is different. While philosophers express it literally, so philosophical theories are the literal expressions of the truth, while religious teachings consist of symbolic rendering of the same philosophical truth, so that the masses who do not study philosophy or theology can understand and take heed and organize their life accordingly. On the other hand, Muslim theologians, especially Ash'arite theologians from the Ash'arite school had a conception of rational theology quite limited. So they even argued that we cannot know the moral truth on the basis of reason, let alone the religious teachings that are, given us in religion, expressed by prophets.
Okay, that makes sense. How contemporary are those debates? I know they occurred in earlier centuries, but do those debates continue today? You're a philosopher from the Islamic tradition, so you're on one side, I assume. Are there people today on the other side who say, what you do may be nice, but maybe it's not as good as what the theologians can do?
Actually, we can have a look at the issue from different perspectives. One thing is, Muslim philosophers like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, they had a, let's say, strong realistic epistemologies. I mean, they understood that we can know reality as it is on rational grounds. Even though our knowledge about God is limited, our knowledge about God is based on our knowledge of things in our investigation of existent, coexistent, but still what we know, what a philosopher knows, represents reality as it is. And what a prophet teaches and what a philosopher knows, correspond to each other. The only difference is prophets, somehow makes the literal truth or transform the literal truth into metaphorical expressions so that people understand. So now, do you know that, can we defend such a strong realistic epistemology, especially after Immanuel Kant? Obviously everything is gone, right? And as far as the position of Muslim theologians, obviously when we say Muslim theologians, we have like Mu'tazilite theologians who upheld human reason in a more positive manner than Ash'arite theologians. For Mu'tazilite theologians, human beings can know moral truth on the basis of reason alone, and what religion does to confirm those ethical rules, right?
Okay.
And from an Ash'arite theological perspective, obviously our knowledge about the reality and our knowledge about the truth of religion and moral truth is quite limited, because we cannot reach objective, universal truth that may be granted by all human beings, all rational, reasonable human beings. And strangely enough, in today's world, in the process of globalization, obviously, it seems that the universal truths agreed upon by, let's say, important figures around the world coming from different religious or cultural backgrounds seem to be getting, smaller and smaller and smaller.
Right. So from that viewpoint, from the standpoint of Islam today, what is the attitude toward do all or most religions worship the same God? I think there are two categories. One is the Abrahamic religions as a subset, with Islam being with Judaism and Christianity, and then going beyond, whether it's Hinduism, Buddhism, or many other varieties.
Actually, Al-Farabi's conception of religion seems to invite or seems to be open to a so-called religious pluralism position in as debated in modern times. John Hicks, for example, as one of the best representatives of religious pluralism, postulated a God or ultimate reality beyond what specific religions teach. And all this ultimate reality is experienced by certain people under certain historical social conditions, and all the information given about that ultimate reality is limited to certain historical social conditions, all religious teachings. And from Al-Farabi's perspective, at first sight, philosophers know the ultimate reality or the truth as far as it can be on human reason. And as I said, he had a strong realistic position on epistemology. But really, people who established religions, prophets and religious leaders, obviously translate this literal philosophical truth into certain cultural, social conditions, and so that relevant people adopt and leave them. So one literal truth may be translated into many divergent religious teachings.
We appreciate John Hick. In fact, we interviewed him for Closer to Truth a few months before he died. So it was a great honor to be able to do that. And and as you said, when he got down to that core, I think he called it the real, and that was about all he would define. It would have some supernatural elements to it, but it was basically the real. But my question is, in Islam today, is that a recognized position of Islamic philosophers? I know there are a lot of different.
Okay, today, you mean today. So today, there are people, I mean, depending on the country, I mean, it's kind of difficult to make generalizations, of course, but we can say that there are people who may be considered as exclusivists, religious exclusivists, meaning that there is only one truth, and since what I believe is true, and all contradicting beliefs about God, the ultimate reality, human destiny, whatever, must be wrong. And people who do not have, acknowledge true religious beliefs may not go to heaven or paradise. There are also people defending a kind of inclusivistic position, saying that, when we look at the Quran, there are, many verses in the Quran indicating that certain beliefs and certain practices of non-Muslims, especially Christians and Jews, would be acceptable in some sense, even though some beliefs and some practices of Christians and Jews, and of course, all the beliefs of the Meccan polytheists were criticized, still some of them are acknowledged. So they say the human responsibility has something, to do with human power, and depending on where you are born, which cultural conditions you have, they, to a great extent, influence what an individual believes, especially regarding the answers of the questions, which cannot be answered absolutely in such a way as to convince all rational human beings.
Okay, well, look, all the major religions seem to have that division between exclusivists and pluralists. Some smaller religious groups are pluralistic to begin with, so that makes sense. I want to ask the question regarding in Islam about religious or mystical experiences. How important are Islamic mystics in terms of knowing God and transmitting that information? They know more. Do Islamic mystics know more about God than, say, analytic philosophers?
Okay, this is a given question. Obviously, again, we can look at the issue from the perspective of historical figures, and also we can look at the issue considering the current situation, contemporary situation. But in general, generally speaking, Sufis think that the true religious life, the true understanding of God and the true understanding of religious teachings must be verified and somehow related to religious experience. If you are a truly believing person, you have to have a kind of, you have to have an experience of what you think, what you believe. So they say that, you know, all the rational discourse, some of them just dismiss rational discourse, and some of them, you know, humiliate or haze rational discourse. But some of them may say that, you know, this is a preparatory stage for the true knowledge, true religious life. But the question is, the mystical experience and mystical experience claims based on mystical experience cannot be, let's say, cannot be confirmed, or you cannot apply the check and balances. I mean, when a person claims that I have such an experience of God and God told me this and that, you cannot say, you know, let me check if God really told it to you, right? So, and it has a lot of problems, and obviously, in principle, one may respect that there are certain people, there may be certain people with special properties and abilities to have deep religious experience, but still, at times, such claims of religious experience is open to abuse of the religious sensitivities of people.
Let's talk about the traits of God. And first, in Islam, is it proper to describe God, Allah, the divine reality, as a person, a personal being with personhood features like awareness and intent, will?
Actually, in the Quran, obviously there are a lot of verses talking about God, describing God's properties, and God, the properties that we ascribe to persons in our daily language, daily discourse, are also attributed to God. So, for example, God knows, God hears, God sees, and God is powerful. God helps his creatures and his people. And God gets angry when people do not, meet their what they are supposed to do. And so we see a lot of properties attributed to God, the properties that are attributed to persons. In that sense, God, for example, compared to a Taoist conception of God, we can say that God is considered to be like a personal being, even though in Islam and Islamic theological discourse, God is not taught as a person, probably because of the Christian discourse about persons and etc. But clearly, God is personal, but God is not a person in a sense. We can say something like this.
Okay. What are specific attributes of God in Islam? And in particular, how does Islamic philosophy relate to what in the Christian world is often called perfect being theology, all the omnis, omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, because some say that Islamic philosophy during the Middle Ages was actually a precursor or a foundation for perfect being theology that later developed very richly in the Christian tradition.
Actually, as I said, to God in the Quran attributed many properties that are predicated of human beings. Some of the properties attributed to God, philosophers and theologians interpreted them in a kind of negative way but some of them representing a perfection. They are attributed to God, but as opposed to creation, creatures, human beings, God is supposed to have all of them, or at a maximum level of those properties. So the perfect being theology can definitely be integrated or has a definite foundation in medieval Islamic philosophical and theological discussions. So God is omnipotent, meaning God can do everything that can be done. God is omniscient, and meaning that God can know everything that can be known. And in fact, probably we can talk about later, God's knowledge is different from knowledge of human beings, in the sense that our knowledge is based on already existing things, and our knowledge is limited within space-time conditions, while God's knowledge is the cause of everything that exists. So God knows everything that exists, that can be known. So in that sense, the omni properties are attributed to God.
In Islamic philosophical tradition, how does the negative versus positive ways of understanding God, technically the apophatic versus cataphatic tradition?
In Islam, the basis of religion is a book. Is a book which consists of pronounced expressions, and this is the ultimate religious authority. And at first, after the Prophet Muhammad died, people had to understand what's going on, what does actually the Quran says, especially when Muslim people came across more and more with, let's say, Christian theological discussions in different lands, which came under the political hegemony of Muslim leaders. They had to understand, they had to make sense of the Quran. And the first option was to understand or to interpret all the predications of God in the Quran literally. And if it says that God, if it talks about God's hand, then God must have a hand, some kind of. If it says something like this, it must be literally true, and etc., etc. And in a positive way, all the positive properties. But in time, after a while, they realized that taking all the statements, Quranic statements, predicating certain properties of God in a positive way, apophatic way, or cataphatic way, is problematic. And we had this, the opposite interpretation, taking God's transcendence as the foundation, the governing principle. They try to understand all the Quranic verses predicating certain properties of God as understood or as governed by this principle of God's difference from creation. So when you say God knows, it means that God is not ignorant, but it doesn't say anything positive about God. But after a while, again, people realize that if you totally negatively interpret all the Quranic verses, then obviously you deprive the text out of its epistemic value. So all the medieval Islamic discussions is somehow in between. Still, people underlining that God is different from creation, but some people argue in a negative way, not totally in a negative way. Some of them emphasize the positive import of those attributes predicated of God, but still try to make sure that God is transcendent. But in some sense, this is a huge problem for Muslims. There seems to be no theory of theological language agreed upon by all important groups, intellectual groups.
Okay, well, that's a common characteristic of all religions. Let's talk about the actions of God. And the main one, of course, is how was the world created by God? I know your PhD dissertation at Harvard was on creation, a comparative study between Avicenna's and Aquinas's position. How similar were their views on divine creative action? I think you state that Avicenna maintains that God's creative action is similar to the actions of natural things, which is very interesting. It seems contradictory to God's creation being voluntary, the intent of a person. So I'd like to understand how that all works.
Thank you very much, Robert, for asking this question. And this is a crucial question. And probably we can, a little bit revise the question. Usually, Ibn Sina is understood to argue that creation is like a natural action, even though in his texts, he clearly states that, despite all these, all these points about the nature of creation, creation is not like a natural action. He clearly says something like this. And many interpreters emphasize that this is like a natural action. So let me try to explain a little bit. Ibn Sina, for him, God is a necessary being, and everything else other than God is an effect of God. God knows himself, and by knowing himself, he also knows all his effects. And the universe is God's concomitance. God, given the cause, the effect, the universe as God's effect must exist. So the universe is God's necessary concomitant. But the existence of the universe is based on God's knowledge of himself. And Ibn Sina clearly denies that God has an intention in creating. Like, let me create the world so that such and such things happen, and etc., etc. God does not, go after an intention, something he wants after and other than himself. From Ibn Sina's perspective, intention in this sense would serve like a final cause for God. God, in a sense, trying to achieve something. So Ibn Sina clearly rejects that God does not have a final cause pushing him to create the universe or to create this and that things. So in that sense, creation does not have God does not have an intention in creation, but still Ibn Sina says creation is a voluntary action of God. Why? Because creation includes or is based on divine knowledge of the universe, divine approbation, divine, let's say, conformity or divine allowance for the existence of God. So Ibn Sina interprets or redefines divine will, taking into account the way God is. So, for example, in our case, human case, we are voluntary agents. We may want certain things to achieve certain things, to do this, to do that, and all what we seek after is something different from us, and we need that. So our volition, voluntary activities, shows that we are not perfect. But since God is perfect, he cannot be, seeking after something. So he redefines the meaning of will when it is applied to God, and people, most of the time, emphasizing the difference between the nature of human voluntary actions and divine voluntary action as a creation, argue that for Ibn Sina, creation is like a natural action, even though Ibn Sina is well aware of the difficulties and clearly states that creation is not a natural action.
That's a very sophisticated parsing of the concept of necessary for the universe and voluntary. So that's taking each of those words and carefully sculpting them so that they don't contradict each other. I mean, whether you agree with that or not, it's a very sophisticated and a deep understanding. And I really love that.
Exactly, yeah.
But then to have a scene of the universe, I think would have no temporal beginning because it's necessary in this co-relationship with God. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. Let me explain. This is the other part. God is the essential cause of the universe, meaning that when God is, the universe must exist. In order to create the universe, God does not need anything else. So, for Ibn Sina, the essential cause and its effect coexist, must coexist. Given the essential cause, its effect must exist. So God is the essential cause of the universe, and as long as God is, the universe exists. So the universe cannot begin to exist from Ibn Sina's perspective. If we say that the universe began to exist after not existing, it means that God is not the sufficient and efficient cause of the universe, so that in time that something happened to God, somehow completing God or changing his mind, created, and all this change and completion by something else is totally opposite to or unacceptable given the conception of God as the absolutely perfect, unchangeable, eternal being.
Yeah, that is a very defensible position. I know John Polkinghorne, the quantum physicist who became an Anglican priest and wrote greatly on science and religion, and we've been proud to feed him on Closer to Truth, said that whether God created with a beginning or without a beginning, to him made no difference, which to a lot of Christian philosophers, that was sort of a shocking statement because they were wedded to the concept of beginning. But to him, he said, either one, the universe is dependent upon God. And so, you know, I have no critical relationship to which way it would be, because either way, God is behind it. But my question to you, though, in Islamic philosophy, wouldn't that undermine the Kalam cosmological argument?
Exactly, exactly. And Ibn Sina clearly argues that beginning to exist, from his perspective, his notion of universe, obviously is different from the notion of the universe as it is investigated by natural sciences or in natural sciences. So he said that the universe cannot begin to exist if it is taken as a whole. What is the universe? What does the universe consist of? The universe, the things that are subject to generation and corruption. From his cosmological scheme, only things within the sublunar world are subject to generation and corruption. And things above, like the intellects, heavenly spheres, heavenly souls, and etc., they are sometimes associated with angels, as it is taught by religions. There are spiritual beings, and they are not subject to time. So if they are included within the universe, atemporal things, the whole universe cannot begin to exist, because there are things that are not subject to time and beginning from Ibn Sina's perspective. So he says basically this Kalam cosmological argument does not quite fit with the conception of God, eternal God, who is sufficient and efficient cause of the whole universe, not only the things within the or under the sublunar world.
Let's go through a number of questions, and I'd like very short answers in terms of Islamic philosophy, so we get through a number of these. So first question is, once God created the universe, does the universe in reality have an independent existence such that God doesn't need to do more, or must God be actively sustaining it at every moment?
Okay, this is such a nice question. And sometimes people thought that for philosophers, especially Ibn Sina, God creates and God somehow loses his control over the universe. Especially Kalam theologians argued this way, and the Al-Ghazali's argument, for example, against Ibn Sina and philosophers regarding the necessary causal relations is a reflection on this issue. For Ibn Sina, God is the essential cause of the universe, and the relationship between an essential cause and the effect continues always. For example, from Ibn Sina's perspective, God simply is not a cause making the universe begin to exist, but at each and every moment, God keeps the universe causing the universe so that the universe exists. If God did not cause the universe at any moment, stop causing the universe would not exist. So, for example, let's think about a human being, an individual human being. An individual human being is born, grows this and that way. For example, you and I sit down on our chairs. For any instance, every minor thing, you have a causal chain. The causal chain is one causal chain is a vertical causal chain, starting from God, heavenly intellect, spheres, and the last 10th intellect. And then for any individual, any situation, there is also a horizontal causal chain. So at each moment, for example, I'm sitting right now on my chair and you do the same. Our sitting on the chair, instead of like falling down or anything, all this, natural causal, preparatory causal agents must be there, but at the same time, God, as the essential cause of everything, every event, must be causing at the same time. So any given situation is explained not only through this horizontal causal chain from Ibn Sina's perspective, but at the same time, the vertical causal chain. So for each situation, you have a combination of vertical and horizontal chains of causes.
Let's ask the question then, as God intervenes in human affairs, whether it's lives of individuals, miracles, prayers, or the history and fate of nations, does God violate the laws of nature when God intervenes? Actually, this is a huge controversy between Muslim philosophers and especially Ash'arite theologians. Al-Ghazali is famous for his criticism raised against philosophers, including and probably especially Ibn Sina, Avicenna. Does God, Ibn Sina, for Ibn Sina, everything that happens is necessary. In a sense, all things have their natural properties, and given their natural properties, the results necessarily happen. So Muslim theologians thought that if there is a necessary causal nexus governing the whole universe, then you cannot find a place for miracles. Miracles are important, especially from an Islamic viewpoint, because miracles are supposed to be one of the important evidence for the claim for true prophecy. So a true prophet, claiming a prophecy, divine support, and etc., as an evidence for his claim, shows or works out a miracle breaking out the natural laws, right? But in that sense, from Ibn Sina's perspective, there is a, let's say, regular course of natural actions, but he explains the breaking of the natural laws by introducing the powerful souls. So
in the course of natural events, obviously the properties of natural things have a part, but at the same time, the supernatural things have a part as well. It's kind of complicated to explain, but everything on this world, in the sublunar world, subject to generation and corruption, all the forms they assume are given by the giver of forms, the 10th intellect. And the heavenly souls, the heavenly sphere, prepares the matter to assume those forms emanated by the heavenly intellect. But Avicenna also says that powerful human souls may also affect the assumption of a piece of matter, a certain form. So the soul of a prophet, let's say, a powerful soul who is supported by God, may also have the power to, affect matter to assume certain forms. For example, then a piece of cotton, instead of being burned by when it touches fire, a powerful soul may affect the elements such that it may not work.
Okay, this brings up in Islamic metaphysics the whole concept of causation. And does causation in general, does it require anything beyond that which we would say is in the physical world? I know occasionalism has been part of Islamic thinking and controversial, obviously, in which God has to have some type of intervention in every aspect of causation.
Okay, as I tried to explain, from Ibn Sina's perspective, for any given event, you can have a, let's say, preparatory horizontal chain of causes, and at the same time a vertical essential chain of causes for any given event. So no event happens without any cause, strict causal connections, but any event does not simply occur on the basis of natural horizontal causes, but at the same time a vertical causal chain. Okay. And as opposed to this conception of causal connection among events, especially Muslim theologians of the Ash'arite school wanted to emphasize divine power and control over the universe, and they thought that if there is a causal connection between events, given such and such a properties of fire, and given such and such properties of cotton, when they when they get together, touched, then there is fire burns the cotton. But they say that there is no necessary properties of things. The course of events can be explained simply as the divine custom. God, for them, creates on such and such occasions, usually as a customarily, fire burning cotton, and this cause making that customarily. But there is no necessary connection. So they thought that this paradigm would give more freedom to God would confirm the divine control over the things in the universe.
What is the place of theology in metaphysics? Normally we use metaphysics to try to explain theology, but the opposite, where theology is affecting the metaphysics, especially concerning the nature and philosophical depth of human knowledge of God. I think you mentioned that Avicenna takes that God is not the subject matter of metaphysics, but is among the things sought after in metaphysics.
Thank you. And Ibn Sina, as I said, all our knowledge about God, rational knowledge about God, is obtained via our metaphysical investigation. And the subject matter of metaphysics is existent, qua-existent. So we try to investigate to understand the existent insofar as it is existent, and we reach that there must be a principle for the existent which does not exist on its own. And again, all our knowledge about God, what this principle can be, is based on our knowledge about existence contained within the universe, contained within the making up the universe. So Ibn Sina, for example, says, to emphasize this, what we say about God is either negation. So looking at things within the world, within the universe, we emphasize God's transcendence, or he says a relation. So we can say something of God in relation to creation. So we can, looking at the world and certain activities and how they are produced, and we, for example, consider a person who is able to achieve a certain action. This guy is a powerful guy. This guy must have a power to do this and that. And in looking at this, we attribute God power in relation to creation. It is not exact. We are not, talking about God in himself, but simply we are transferring our experience of the existent, qua-existent to somehow talk about God.
What then is ultimate reality in Islamic philosophy? And we like to ask the question, what exists? By that we mean, what are the fundamental, non-reducible categories of all reality? If you reduce things down to their non-reducible level, what are the categories? Is it only God? Or is it God in the universe? Or is it the laws of physics? In other words, what are the non-reducible categories of reality?
There's a saying that a mystic, once the students of a mystic, the Sufi master, a student comes and relays a prophetic tradition to the Sufi master. The Prophet alayhi salam said, there was a time there only God existed and nothing did beside God. And the Sufi master says, still it is the case. So this is a Sufi approach. There is only one God and there is nothing else. Only one existence, one being, and all the things are somehow the manifestations of one and the same being, this so-called unity of being, the theory of unity of being, which may be traced back to Ibn Arabi and some Sufi masters. But from a philosophical and Islamic theological perspective, obviously they acknowledge the existence and independence of the things within the universe. So all the material things, not only the material things, but also human souls as spiritual beings exist and they are independent, and according to, as it is explained in religious texts, God addresses them, God sends prophets, and God, for example, accepts their prayer, and God will hold them responsible for their actions, and etc., etc. Obviously, they acknowledge the existence of things other than God.
We're out of time, but I have to ask you two more questions, and I'd like just extremely short answers, almost a yes or no.
Okay.
First is does God know the future in terms of every specific thing that will happen, or is the future open and God may have some generality or bring about his will, but doesn't know the actions of free human beings?
See, this is such an interesting question. Discussed in modern analytic philosophy as well as medieval philosophy. And for Ibn Sina and for many Muslim philosophers, maybe also including Thomas Aquinas, it doesn't make much sense if God knows the future, because everything that exists, that come to exist, can exist simply because God knows it to exist. So nothing can come to exist without being known by God to exist in such and such a way under such and such conditions. So it doesn't make much sense if you take the difference between divine knowledge, which is creative, and human knowledge, which is based on already existing things.
Okay, that actually sounds coherent. Maybe I'm a little mixed up, but it sounds coherent. Last question, and I hate to end with evil, but it's a question we have to address. How does Islamic philosophy deal with the problem of evil, which to my perception is a deeper or more important question in Christian philosophy, and how to deal with evil, because you have an omnipotent God that's also omnibenevolent and all good. So how do you relate those two? That does not seem to be as significant an issue in Islamic philosophy. Is that right?
Actually, it was important, even though the problem of evil was not an important problem as it is today for medieval Muslim theologians and philosophers. But still, in order to have a, let's say, coherent and comprehensive account of what exists and what's going on, they had to answer that question. And in Islamic philosophy, in a way similar to medieval Christian theology, like the case of Thomas Aquinas and especially St. Augustine, they had a notion of goodness associated with being. So everything that is good exists, or existence is good, and the evil is only a kind of imperfection or lack of existence. So from Ibn Sina's perspective, for example, he says everything God creates is good because, first of all, only God can be absolutely good. Nothing other than God can be absolutely perfect. Nothing other than God can absolutely exist. So the universe necessarily must, include evil, must be imperfect. So from his perspective, only God creates, and what is created is good. But he says, in some sense, the universe is best of all possible worlds. In some sense, I mean, it's kind of a complicated issue, but let me try to simplify as far as possible. If he says within the evil, as we know, is found as a natural evil and moral evil, as opposed to metaphysical evil, is found only in the world of generation and corruption, the sublunar world, which is only a small, minor part of the whole universe. So Avicenna says, God, for example, would not create the universe, given the fact that in this world of generation and corruption, necessarily there must be evil. God would hold creation, would not allow the universe. But then he says, God would be, holding back more good for the sake of or because of less evil, and it wouldn't, suit the divine generosity.
Yes, people might call that rationalization, but I appreciate the analysis. In learning Islamic philosophy, there are obviously a lot of similarities, and based on the generation in the Middle Ages of Jewish philosophy, Christian philosophy, and Islamic philosophy. But the one thing I have learned from Islamic philosophy is more of a commitment and an appreciation of the concept of existence and being. that seems to, in Islamic philosophy, have more of a fundamental aspect to it. So, I appreciate our conversation. Wish we could do more, but we'll look forward to more in the future, whether God knows it or not.
Thank you very much, Robert, for organizing and for this lovely occasion to talk and to share my ideas. Thank you so much.